My name is Carol Hale, and I'm going to be your host and moderator for this evening. If you have questions regarding any of the content, please post them in the comment section of the Facebook live stream, and I will do my best to relay them on to our guest at the appropriate time. Today, we are pleased to welcome Diana Staresinic-Deane for her presentation, Researching Your Home and the People Who Lived There. Our program tonight is brought to us and you, the community, by Humanities Kansas. They are an independent nonprofit spearheading a movement of ideas to empower the people of Kansas to strengthen their communities and our democracy. We will have a question and answer session at the end of Diana's presentation, so feel free to leave, again, your questions in the comment section. Diana is a Kansas City, Kansas native who is the executive director of the Franklin County Historical Society and also the Old Depot Museum in Ottawa. She is interested in collecting, interpreting, and recording local histories, and she is particularly interested in learning microhistories, which is the history of a single person, single place, or a single object. Diana is also the author of the book Shadow on the Hill, the true story of a 1925 Kansas murder. She joined the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau in 2018. We have invited Diana not only to share her knowledge with our community, just for an individual benefit, but also in preparation for the upcoming Smithsonian Crossroads exhibit coming to Kansas this year. Norton will be one of the will actually be the final host site for the traveling exhibit, and we are hoping the presentation tonight will inspire local community members to dig into our local history and help curate local historical vignettes. To find out more about the Crossroads exhibit, I will post a link in the comments section to the Humanities Kansas website. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Diana.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so we can get started. And I also want to say, you know, I was so excited about being asked to come to Norton. My husband and I love traveling around the state and exploring. We had set aside a 4-day trip to settle in your area and just go check things out. And we just didn't realize we'd have a pandemic on our hands when the time came to actually do this program. So we're doing it this way, but I sure hope that we can get out to Norton because it's an area we've not explored before and there's a lot of history there. Okay, as I was just introduced, I love house history. And one of the reasons, let me see if I can get in here. Oh, here we go. Okay, when I was about 9 or 10, Scholastic Books used to offer these wonderful collections of ghost stories. And if you're a ghost story aficionado, you might recognize this picture. It's the Brown Lady of Raynham Hall. And what happened was this ghost apparently was haunting this hall for many years. And when the photographers for Country Life magazine, and we're talking about like manners, not like country life like we experience country life in Kansas, when they came out in the 1930s to photograph the building, they saw this ghost coming down the stairs and they rushed over to take a picture, and what they got was what you see on the screen. It's kind of like a shadowy statue of a Virgin Mary. But I was enthralled with this picture, and I realized it wasn't so much that I liked the idea of a house being haunted, because I actually kind of find that terrifying and a little sad to be stuck in a house, especially if you didn't like it. But I love the idea of this conduit to the past, this sort of way of connecting to the history of the building. And that really got me started in my love for house history. And I remember, you know, reading the Babysitters Club books when I was a kid, the first time they came out, and just being so upset that, unlike Dawn, my 1950s ranch house was not part of the Underground Railroad. So I love house history. And one of the things we'll talk about is, oops, wrong button here, is that there's a lot of different ways to look at property history. So some of the things we'll be looking at today: how to identify the space we're in, the tools that you have available to you, following those breadcrumbs to keep digging, and then how to take all the stuff you find and turn it into a narrative that you can share. Research can tell us all kinds of things: who occupied our land, any changes to the land or house or business, and then major things that happened on your land or around your community. Here's the first really important idea I want you to take away. Real people lead real lives in real houses. You do not have to have a very old house. You don't have to have an infamous house. You don't have to have a fancy house. You don't have to have a Victorian. You don't have to have a murder scene. You don't even have to have a house. I mean, if you're pitching a tent on someone's back 40, you've got a story attached to that back 40. So don't be discouraged if what you're researching is a house that your family built in 1986, because it's still on land that is so much older than us, and there's a story to be told there. The first big question is, where are you? And it sounds a little glib, but I bring this up because your address may not have always been your address. Street names change. What you're looking at here is a map of Pomona here in Franklin County. And what you'll notice is the current street names are in black and the previous street names are in red. And one of the things all of our counties saw as people were converting counties to be ready for 911 is changing street names, because it turns out it's a lot easier for an ambulance to find you if you have an address and not just trying to remember where the red barn that belonged to the Wilsons was when it's raining and they're trying to get to you while you're having a heart attack. So a lot of changes were made, and I've seen some pretty drastic ones. Sometimes it happens, like in KCK, when cities were incorporated into Kansas City, Kansas, the street names were sometimes renumbered to match or renamed to match the city, and so it took over all the old names. And a really crazy one I've seen is in Basehor, Kansas, which is in Leavenworth County, where it was one of those places where it had the numbers one way and the tree names, you know, cedar, oak, maple, the other direction. When they went to renumber the county for 911, they recognized Kansas City was encroaching. So they decided to continue the Kansas City street numbers, 147, 148, 149. And then when they got to Basehor, the street numbers were now going the wrong direction. So the trees became street numbers, 150, 151, 152, and first, second, and third became the trees. That gets really confusing when you're trying to figure out how to research your address. So what's the answer to that? You need your legal description. It's usually cumbersome. Ottawa Original Town East 57.5 lots 29, 31, 33, 35, block 60, section 36, township 16, range 19 east is not the typical address you'd give for the Ottawa Friends of the Library. But this is a legal address, and you're probably wondering, where did these even come from? So here are our intrepid surveyors. Back in 1785, if I'm remembering, the public land survey system was developed. And the reason why was a lot of times on the East Coast, you would see these land descriptions that say, you know, Madam Goodwife owns from the red barn to the tree stump to the creek. And the problem is these are all transient things. And so they needed something a little more official. So these guys, and they did this in Kansas starting in the 1850s, stretched these chains called Gunter chains. The Gunter chains are 66 feet long, and let me make sure I get this right. One chain is 66 feet, 80 chains is a mile. A mile, of course, is a section. And so you basically end up building a grid, this beautiful grid. And whether there's a lake there, whether a volcano comes out of the ground, no matter what's going on, that grid is still correct. And so now it's more like trying to find a battle, you're playing Battleship. You just need to know your coordinates and you can get there. And once you can find your section, you can find your northwest corner of that section, or the northwest quarter of the northwest quarter, or a subdevelopment in that northwest quarter of the northwest quarter, and then the lot numbers. You can, and so it starts to help you parse that out. And no matter what happens to the land, you can trace that back. So where do you find this legal address? If you have a property deed or a mortgage, it should be on there. If you are a renter and you don't have those things, or you can't get your hands on them, the county appraiser's office and the county register of deeds can help you. I could not find, a lot of counties have online lookup systems. It did not appear that Norton does, but I'm sure they would be happy to help you find your legal address. And once you have that, you can take a field trip to the Register of Deeds office. Now, this is actually my Register of Deeds here in Franklin County, but they all pretty much look alike. They're really giant, incredibly heavy books that have every single transaction that's ever happened to your land. And so when you, if you have the paper books, which I believe that you do from the pictures I've seen, you can basically find the index and find your property, and those little X's going down will show you every time something happened to your property. Now, keep in mind, this is not about houses on your property, it is about the land. So it will show you if the land's been divided, it will show you if there are oil and gas leases or easements, it'll show you sheriff sales, it will show you all kinds of things like that about the land. And you can trace back, like if you're in a subdivision, you can trace back when your subdivision was previously farmland, for example. Usually at the Register of Deeds office, you can find other cool things like plat maps and maps of all sorts. And my experience with the Register of Deeds, they are the history keepers of the land. It is one of the most important things we can do, which is keep that chain of ownership. And they generally like helping people with this. Just call ahead and let them know that you need help, because if everyone is sick except for one person and they're busy, they may not be able to help you as easily, but generally they're into this as much as we are. Now, if you're really, really lucky, you may have an abstract for your property. Abstracts have pretty much gone away by about the late 1980s because of computer documentation. However, if you happen to have one, cherish it. You can have them remade, but I have seen, depending on how, think about every time there's a lawsuit or any kind of change of ownership, there's going to be paperwork. If you have a house that maybe changes over every 10 years and it's a 120-year-old house, you may be looking at several $100s to get an abstract reproduced. I actually encountered someone who got a quote $1,200 to have their abstract made because there was so much that had happened. So, but like my house in Emporia before we moved to Ottawa, we were lucky enough to have an abstract, which when we moved, I donated to the Historical Society to make sure it was cared for. But one of the pages we found was actually about a lawsuit, and we were stunned to discover that our house had a connection to one of Emporia's most infamous murder cases of the 20th century. Marty and Lorna Anderson, who are listed on this legal document, were part of what was known as the Bird murder. Sandy Bird was the wife of a minister, and she and Marty Anderson were both murdered, and the convicted were their respective spouses who were having an affair. So the fact that they owned our house and were really upside down on a mortgage just was fascinating to us, because I believe this document was just like a couple of years before the crimes happened. Okay, how did the first owner get his or her land in Kansas? It's super important to acknowledge that before white settlement, this was not empty land. There were people here, there were people who were native to this area, and then there were immigrant tribes that were forced into this area. Depending on where you live in Kansas will vary who was there at any given time. I suspect you're kind of up in the area like where the Pawnee maybe were. So it's really important to acknowledge that there's a story there as well. And there are a lot of neat maps that will at least help you identify places where these different groups of people lived and make that part of the story of your property. even if we don't have their names, because they were here. There was not just a big vacant sign. However, who was the first person to get an actual deed? And sometimes it was a tribe, sometimes it was a reservation, but otherwise it was going to be a person of some sort. And there is a document known as the BLN Tract Book, where they recorded every single person who got a land grant. You can access these for free online. One of the handouts that you will get will show you how. I will tell you there are 72 volumes for Kansas. And what you'll need to do is figure out which volume has your range and township and then flip the pages. And when you're looking, you're going to want to look for big tracts of land, because those early land deeds were farms. They weren't going to be lots. So you're going to have to think, big plots of land. This page happens to be where my house is, and it shows that the land was originally deeded to the Ottawa Indian tribe for a school. So we've already got kind of a toolbox letting us know about ownership and how to read those land descriptions and how land was subdivided, how land came into the hands of people. Now let's look at maps. And I have this in giant letters because maps are where I really geek out. I love maps so much because they just tell us so many things. Remember these guys. So here is an example, and I'm sorry, I looked for one for Norton County, but I could not find one. But this is actually from the eastern side of the state. This is what the surveyors were doing. They were walking up and down Kansas, and anything that wasn't grass was interesting enough to document. And so picture these guys stretching those chains 66 feet at a time. And here's what they were drawing in. If there were places that were already being cultivated, if there was a reservation. And you will notice these little trails. Can you see my arrow moving around on the screen? No, okay. So I'll just have to describe and hope you can catch it. So you will see like these little roads moving through. And the roads to me are super interesting because think about how roads would have developed over time. They were looking for how to get to another place as painlessly as possible. Before there were bulldozers and earth movers and all kinds of other things. And so these roads squiggled and moved in all kinds of interesting ways. And they were going to be the path of least resistance, not necessarily the most direct route. Now, some of these roads remain. If you've ever been out driving and you're like, this is a squiggly road, it's probably the old wagon road somewhere. That was just the most logical thing to keep. But a lot of our roads have been beaten into section lines over time. And so they don't exist anymore. But that doesn't mean that the remnant of that road might not go right through your house or right through your yard. And to show you an example of this, this is one of my favorite pictures here in Franklin County. This is bridge number 3 under construction across the Staresinic-Deane River. And the reason why this is such a cool picture is not so much because of the bridge, but what's happening in the background. So if you see where that red circle is, we're going to zoom in. That's a pair of cars zipping along the riverbed because that's where the natural ford was. All of the roads north and south of the river funneled into this ford, which was the easiest place to cross the river. It's not where the Main Street Bridge is. It's not Main Street, but it was the most logical place to cross. And you could still do this right up until the levees were built through downtown in the 1950s and 60s. But looking at it today, you don't realize necessarily that that's where the road was. Plat books are another excellent resource, and there are 3 of these available online between kansasmemory.org and Historic MapWorks. And it's possible that your county may have others available as well. But these you can access without ever putting on clothes. You can stay in your pajamas and do this at your computer. And plat books are wonderful, especially if you're researching what is rural or what was formerly rural, because it shows us all kinds of neat details. So this is, let me see, I wrote this down. The township of, I want to say, is it Modell? Okay, cool. So we're going to zoom in and we'll show you some things that you can see here. Okay, if you look in section 15 up in the corner, Right across in section 14, you can see a cemetery. In section 23, you can see a spring, another one in section 22. I really admire, you guys have a lot of natural water in your county. It's just all over the place. You can see roads, you can see the river, you can see the Missouri Pacific, which I think is awesome because if you follow that path right up, you can take it right up to my building, the Old Depot Museum almost. It's just, it connects us, which is really neat. You can see squiggly roads, you can see all the people who owned things. And if you happen to notice the little black boxes, little, like just tiny little squares, those are the houses. So this is really rich in information and really gives you a sense of how families lived in this area, who owned the land, how maybe sections were changed as people sold off land or bought land. It's very, very rich in information. This is also great if you happen to live in a brand new subdivision, because chances are good it was farm before. And so just knowing the section and township and range information, you can get a sense of what was there before your house was there. Okay, Sanborn fire insurance maps. These are absolutely my favoriteest maps ever. I can go down a rabbit hole with these for hours on end for things I'm not even looking for. The purpose of the Sanborn map was really different than what a lot of other maps, like a geographical map or a topographical map are, or a road map. Their job was to inform insurance companies and fire departments of fire risk. So they're going to look at water sources, the construction of structures, and all of the structures that are there. I'll zoom in on this here in just a second. I'll just mention for Norton, there are at least 4 that are available between the Library of Congress and also KU, where you can, on their website, you can find them, and those links are both on the handout. But let's take a closer look. Okay, so to kind of orient you, you see where the courthouse is. You are looking at downtown buildings. If you see a DWG, that's a dwelling. The yellow is usually wood frame structure. I believe pink is usually brick. The one that I find really interesting in this, which I just haven't seen very often, in the lower left, you'll see one that is gray around it, and that means it's ironclad. It's got an iron facade, which I think is super, super cool. So it was a really fancy building, probably with like decorative ironwork. But you can see stairwells, you can see what a lot of those buildings were used for. It would have mattered to them if the building was a foundry, or if the building was a laundry, or if the building was a clothing store. It gives them a sense of how flammable it is. And you can also see, I believe the blue is stone. And some of these, you can tell that there's like lots of different composition. You can see where porches are. You can see the outbuildings. If there was a chicken coop, they mentioned it because the chicken coop is something that catches fire. So there's a lot of information on these. So if you happen to live in the older areas of Norton, your property, you may be able to trace it over the years to see how it's changed and how your neighborhood has changed. Okay. So we keep adding to our toolbox of all the different ways we can look at stuff. Now let's talk about the people who are here. And I realize you can't see the face of the woman in that picture, but that's okay. So the reason why we look at the people who are there, it gives us 2 things. One, when you went to the Register of Deeds and you wrote down everyone who owned your property, it gives you a second way to look things up, because sometimes the newspaper will say, you know, Mr. and Mrs. Smith are building their house, and it doesn't necessarily have an address, but since you know where Mr. and Mrs. Smith were living that year, you can cross-check and find more information. It can also help you if you're looking for renters or businesses that aren't necessarily mentioned on the deed. So it's a really, really wonderful tool. Plus, knowing who lived in your house sometimes helps your house make sense. If you have fantastic woodwork and you know that a carpenter lived there, this makes sense. Sometimes we have a house in town here in Ottawa that is stone that belonged to a stonemason. So there's a little bit of story there too. The census is an excellent resource to help you find out everyone who lived in a house. regardless of whether they owned it or not, including people who were boarding or people who were servants or people who were renters. So there, and it will tell you where they came from and what they did. Sometimes where they came from mattered too. You know, houses that were in communities that were predominantly German sometimes looked really different than houses that were in places that like Lindsberg, where they have kind of that sort of Nordic look to them. And Ellenwood, where the underground businesses were, which was a very German thing to do. It's really interesting how that can influence. Here's the downside about census records. 1890 for Kansas burned up in a fire. There are no records for 1890. Back up your data, folks. But it's gone. However, we can fill in a lot of holes. 1860, 70, 80 are there for the, in 1900, I'm sorry. Those are all there. The fives are there. But unfortunately, 1890 is kind of an important year for a lot of history in Kansas because we're transitioning out of the Victorian period. A lot of the towns are growing in settlement. 1890 is when a lot of your World War I vets were born. So it's kind of a tough time to not have that information. I'm hoping that you guys have some city directories somewhere. I don't know where they're at, but city directories are fabulous. These are ours here for Ottawa. And what's wonderful about city directories is that they can show you things you can cross-reference by address. So you can look up your address and look at what was in the house or who was in the house. It often would tell you the names of people, what they did, what the businesses were. This is really invaluable if you're researching a building downtown, because a lot of times the building would have been built by someone and owned by someone, but would have a series of renters on both the business floor and even in apartments above. So this is a great way to do that. I will say they're not always accurate. I have a acquaintance who is a writer who wrote under a pseudonym, and somehow his pseudonym got listed in the city directory as a resident for his household. And that's going to be very confusing to someone someday. But those kinds of things do happen, or someone's passed away and the directory doesn't catch up to that for a couple of years. So you may run into that, but overall, it's still a really great tool. Okay, people and places, there's so much data, especially older data. What actually scares me about data is present day, because we rely very heavily on having things available online. And like if a newspaper folds, their website goes under and it's gone. Everything is gone. So I'm really thinking that in this age where we have so much information, my concern is down the line, that information will not exist. But for older data, probates and wills are public records. Vital statistics before 1911 are county records, and county records are public. In Kansas, once they go to the state, they're not public. Cemetery records, biographical files, yearbooks, community museums and libraries, the State Historical Society. There are Facebook groups everywhere that love sharing old photos and saying, hey, I found this photo of my grandma. Does anyone know where this is? And it may be the house you're looking for. There's a lot of stuff out there. Photographs are one of my favorite storytellers. The trick about photographs is you have to know how to look for them. Think about how we get pictures at a historical society. So my historical society has 34,000 photographs. Lyon County's Historical Society, where Emporia is, has 100,000 photographs. But if you come in and say, I would like to know if you have any pictures of 832 South Cedar, the likelihood of us being able to pull that up are actually low, because a lot of times we get a box of photographs from a family that says, these are my grandma's photos. I think this house is where she grew up. I really don't know where it was. And so, you know, we'll tag it with the family names. But remember, you've been researching family names. You've got the list of owners. You've been looking at city directories. You've been looking at the census. And you've also got a sense of the history of the house and where it's located. If you are someplace from a historical perspective, lucky enough to have tornadoes or floods or something like that, I mean, there's always someone out with a camera to take a picture of that. So let's look at some of these pictures. So this is a picture from like 1983, 84, and it's titled, you know, Snowdrift after a snowstorm. There's no address, but if you're looking at this picture, you may very well recognize your house in this photo. This is a picture, gosh, I think this one is this Kansas? I think this one is Kansas Avenue from like the 1890s. And so this gives you an idea of what was there. You can read the names of the businesses. You can see the storefronts. If any of these businesses are still standing, it might be yours. This one I actually borrowed from Burlington because I couldn't find any interior photos. But this is a great picture because, again, no address, but if you know that Briggs Pharmacy was in your building, you have a real sense of how your building looked on the inside. This one is from your area. It's a sod house. Obviously, chances are good no one is living in a sod house on your property right now, but it is part of the story of your land. And if you know that your place belonged to J.M. Ray at one point, then this picture will be relevant to you. This one I include because it's kind of wonky. It looks like it's a picture of a man with two gigantic catfish. What it's actually a picture of, if you look at it carefully, is a storefront, and if you look at it really carefully, a reflection of the storefront across the street. And you can see the name, like right now, we don't know what the address is, but if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the awning name is being reflected in the window. So you can potentially orient yourself in town if you know where these businesses are and get a sense of what your storefront may have looked like, either if that's your building or if you have the building across the street, you can get a real sense of what the windows look like. And your town is anything like every other small Kansas town. You have parades and lots of them. People take pictures during parades, and each of those pictures is also about everything that's happening in the background. So there's a lot of documentation out there. You just have to look a little bit more deeply. We have in our collection 1,200 photos that are just of floods, because Franklin County floods enthusiastically and often. And a lot of those pictures are just documented as North 100 block of Main Street or flooding in Ottawa. But when you start looking at them, you know, yeah, the flood is definitely prevalent, but what you're also seeing is the businesses that were there, the storefronts that were there, and there's a lot of rich information. Okay. And also be sure to flip to the back of your plat books, because a lot of times they stick photos back there. Sometimes they're just engraved pictures. These are actually photographs. This came out of the 1917 plat book that's available online. And they're just pictures of random houses around Norton County, and one of them could be yours. Photo postcards. So once the post office decided that it was okay for you to make your own postcard, which was a novel and amazing idea, people tended to make postcards that were pictures of them, pictures of their pets, pictures of their house, pictures of their downtowns, pictures of their businesses. Now, I bought this one at an antique store because honestly, I bought it for the snarky, scathing comments on the back. Dear Kennedy, what is the matter with you? I have written you twice and Johnson once, and I never hear from you. And I just found that hilarious. But when you keep reading, this is my new store building. How do you like it? Ask Mr. K what he thinks of concrete for a building. Solid concrete, except the ceiling and the roof. And so now we have this information of when this building was built, and we knew it was in Ottawa, and it turned out that a woman owned this land and built this building. And it's now gone. It was swept away by a flood in the 1930s, but it helped fill in this story of ownership and when it came to be. And I fell in love with it for that. Newspapers are wonderful. In small towns, especially, everyone's business is everyone's business. I know that the man who built my house had a carbuncle on his neck because they actually reported it in the paper, which is fabulous. Probably not fabulous for him, but I'm just thrilled because it makes him so human. Many Norton County papers are available online, and up through about 1924, you can go to the state library and access them for free online. So definitely take a look. And a lot of others are going to be available on microfilm at your local library too. I will mention, if you are on newspapers.com or Newspaper Archive, you can search for things. So you can search for names, you can search for addresses. When you're searching for addresses, do multiple searches. If you live on North Cedar, try N Cedar and North Cedar, because different eras use different types of standardization on how they handled their the way they spelled things. And so you want to catch as much as you can. Okay. I also want to mention that houses move and buildings move, and they did it all the time because, you know what, building materials were very dear in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And a wood frame house, you could just pop that thing up, set it on a cart and roll it across town. And they did it all the time. And we found out part of my house, which I'll talk about, also was rolled across town and added to. And then if you find that that's the case, you've got a whole additional property to research, a whole additional life of your house to find out about. And look for things that happen in your neighborhood. If you are near train tracks, if you are near the river, there are going to be all kinds of things that happen in those areas that don't necessarily have your house address, but may have happened around your house and could have impacted your house. If your neighbor's house burned down, the cameras are going to be taking pictures of the fire, and there might be your house in the background. So, you know, leave yourself open to more than just looking at your address. So we have a really substantial toolbox to work with, and there's a lot of information here, and it can be kind of overwhelming. So what I want to do is show you my house, which I'm super excited to report. I need a new picture. My porch has been rebuilt. My husband fell through it 2 years ago, and we just rebuilt it to be just like this porch, except we put back the fancy columns, and now we're saving up to do the railing. And you'll see why when we get to a picture that's older. But so here's my house. And as I mentioned, my house shows up, that is on property in a tract book that originally was deeded to the Ottawa Indians. When the land was sold or swindled, depending on how you read the documents, away from the tribe, Robert Atkinson, who was part of Ottawa University, bought the land. And you can look and see over the years, it kind of bounced back and forth. Apparently, one of the things that happened a lot in the towns was people just sort of kept trading property to the next person on the right to drive the prices up. And then it would get lost in a sheriff's sale and it would start all over again. All part of that golden age of building communities. When Atkinson died, his daughters or his kids inherited, and Margaret Topping inherited this land. And you can see this is from the probate. That, you know, this was all of this stuff, including horses, cattle, hogs, and farming implements, were distributed among his children. Margaret Topping said, I really have no use for this property. And she sells it to this handsome fellow. This is Grant Crane. And you will recognize him in every photo because he's got those luscious golden curls. And he bought this land, and he was an interesting person. He was a school teacher from Peoria, from a very old family that had settled here pretty early on and moved around from different schools. He moved to Richmond, Kansas, where he and his wife taught, and he founded the high school there. After she died, he ultimately left the high school and he moved to Ottawa to be a teacher at Ottawa University, and was a pretty amazing professor of business. His students got great jobs. They won typing contests. In fact, one of his students was clocked in at typing at 216 words a minute on a manual typewriter. and demonstrated at the World's Fair. So he was a pretty amazing professor. And there were a lot of these kinds of stories. Back then, faculty served as their own admissions counselors and also their own career services counselors. So he was constantly traveling to both ring up students and then find jobs for his students. So it was really common to see little snippets like this. During this time, Ottawa University built a new administration building, and a couple of days before it was supposed to open, it burned to the ground. And it was across the street from where my house is. And Grant Crane actually ran into the building to try to save all of his brand new equipment. And he came out with just one typewriter that he was able to save before it was too dangerous to go back. This is my house in its glory years. Look at that rail. We are working on this. It's going to cost a fortune, but one day we will have these beautiful spindles back in place. This is from about the 1930s, and there were articles like the one you see here about the house being painted and papered. And we know he moved in because of the city directory. And what I didn't show you is we know that he bought the house from a different block, dragged it here, and then built around. And I'll tell you more about how we figured all that out. So as I mentioned, there were a lot of articles about him traveling, and there was this curious one that said he spent Christmas in Lawrence, and there was one that said Miss Ruby Macy spent Christmas in Lawrence. Well, lo and behold, there's a marriage license where they got married and they just didn't tell anyone. And you'll notice that he's listed as 42 and she's listed as 18, maybe. Other documents suggest she was 18 for several years. He now has ambitions. There's a new business college he wants to build that's a private school. And so he's working on getting land on Main Street, and he's gonna do this. And they finally, after school's over, announced that they've gotten married, and everyone's very excited for them. And they're building their business college. And I'll mention the Jeffries Johnson fight, because this fight was a fight between a black heavyweight boxer and a white heavyweight boxer. And the black boxer won. And a lot of the movie theaters refused to play the footage. And there were protests over this. And in Ottawa, Kansas, because of this fight in New York, workers striked in the building of Grant Crane's new school, and it delayed the construction, which I just think is amazing. So here's the building, and there's all these great ads. There's stories about Grant Crane having furniture lifted up through the windows on the second floor, carloads of furniture on trains. Grant Crane was in the windows throwing candy at people to get their attention about his new business school. It's a modern commercial school. The enrollment is coming forward. It's all happening. The building is actually still there at 5th and Main. But then this happened. Grant Crane gets sued for breach of promise, a $25,000 lawsuit. As it turns out, those trips to Kansas City weren't necessarily for work. It was for another student that he'd been involved with, and for quite a long time. And she thought they were getting married. And one of the reasons why they had had a tiff was because there was another student in Colorado that apparently he hadn't quite let go of either. So she sued him, but good. And what ensues is this delightful collection of newspaper articles that outline the trial. This was the most exciting thing to happen in Ottawa that summer. But what's really amazing, they read his 300 letters on the stand, 300. And what the letters contain are a story of the house he bought, the additions he made, when he added the bedrooms and the bathrooms and the studio, when the telephone line was installed, when the gas line was installed, because he was sending this woman out to buy furniture for a house she would never set foot in. And it was all in the letters. So no one else will care about this because it's salacious enough. But for us researching, it made so much sense of my wonky house that spirals as this Franken house does, so that to get to my office, on the second floor from my bedroom. I have to walk from the bedroom through my sitting room, past the bathroom, through the kitchen, through the living room, up the stairs, and hang a right. It's like 100 yards. My whole house is only 1,300 square feet. So it's this amazing just mine of wonderful data about this house. In the end, by the way, the lawsuit is settled out of court. She gets some cash. I hope she did well. His wife totally stays by his side. They run the business college. It's very successful. We also now know this is probably what happened to the barn in our backyard. He inadvertently drove through it with his unruly automobile. And then he dies in the 1930s in my living room after breakfast. Now, Ruby, and this is, I do finally have another picture of her I just found. She goes on, this young woman, to run the business college and also moves it to a new location, to a building that's actually now the Chamber of Commerce. But after running the business college, really up till about World War II, she was it. And in 1937, her mother dies, actually, and probably in the room I'm in right now, giving this presentation. And she goes on then to do something near and dear to our hearts as house researchers. She was part of the Register of Deeds office after handing over ownership of the business college. She falls on hard times. She ends up renting out part of this house, and it makes sense now, like where the walls are and how some things changed, because she made it into a 3-room apartment. And then she starts having her own health issues, and she eventually sells the house in 1959. So they were in this house, the Cranes had this house from 1903 to 1959, so a really long time. She ultimately moves to Neodesha, where she lives with family, and she lives there right up until 1982. So that is how you take all those weird little bits of information and you turn it into a narrative about your property. And what you will find is that the people who lived in your house, while maybe not quite as interesting as Grant Crane, were humans who did weird things. They got speeding tickets and got into car wrecks, and their houses caught fire. And they were part of, Eastern Star, and their kids were in the band. Maybe they served in World War I. Maybe they served in World War II. Maybe you see that they built an addition. Maybe you find out that they built a garage. Maybe you see an article that they painted their house. There's so many things that connect the human side of your property to the structure of your property and vice versa. And it makes it this really rich connection. And one day you are you're part of that story. And one day someone will be researching the house again, and they're going to want to know what you did and how you contributed to the house and your community. And that is one of the biggest reasons why I think house research is worthwhile, because we find those connections. We get to know our house, we get to know the people ahead of us, behind us, and our neighbors, and how it all fits together from a very local perspective. So with that, that's the basics of what I wanted to talk about. I'm glad to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Diana. I had just a few questions here that and you may have gone over it a little bit, but I'm not sure that I caught it. When you go to the Register of Deeds office, I know you said there was a cost for abstracts. What about any, and those are those at the deed office or?
Abstracts are going to be at abstract offices.
Okay.
Like if you've ever had to do a title search for your property, that's who does those. So you may have an abstract office of some sort or a title company in your community, and that's where you get abstracts. At the Register of Deeds, usually you can look at the books and just write information down at no charge, but they will charge you for printouts, and they will charge you if they have to do the legwork. Okay. So, expect like an hourly fee. If you just call them up and say, I want you to find all the history of my property, they'll probably charge you $18 to $30 an hour to do the work. If you go in and say, I'm doing some research, how do I get started? they'll give you an orientation of the room and just let you have at it, because those are all public records. And then if you need photocopies, they will muscle those books onto the copier for you. But honestly, I have found that now that cell phones are so much better than they used to be, a lot of times, if all you want is to document the information, you can get a pretty good picture with your cell phone if they'll let you do that.
Excellent. That's great to know. And then I also had some questions about the newspapers, and I was just curious if you know of this, or if it's, you said that the newspapers are available up to like 1924. Why is it just up until then?
Okay, so
is there a reason for that?
Okay, let me clarify. So the State Historical Society worked with newspapers.com to scan every single newspaper they had up through 1923 or 24. And the reason for that date is because that is the magic copyright expiration date. So anything from like, I think it's just moved to 1924. For years and years, it was 1923. Anything 1924 and earlier no longer is now in the public domain. They're not going to run into any copyright issues if those papers still exist. And and also it created sort of a more manageable frame, because I can tell you, for example, Lyon County had 44 newspapers in their history. And a lot of that's going to be true for pretty much anywhere you go, because starting a paper was the key to making your town look like a prosperous town. We have a teeny community that has, I don't know, 20 people in it right now, La Loupe. They had a paper. It was for like 3 months, but it was a documented 3 months. So newspapers.com, if you buy a subscription, which is a pretty reasonable price, especially if you already have an ancestry.com subscription. Newspaper archive is a lot more expensive, but they have scanned beyond 1924 for a lot of papers. But sometimes there are holes, like the Ottawa Herald goes to 1926 and then picks up again at like 1951. I don't know why, but there's a big hole there. So we can't search those like 25 years of papers. But for free through the state, you can access every known paper in Kansas that existed 1924 or earlier. Okay. So you do have access to that. It's a fabulous thing that the State Historical Society and State Library did. That's
amazing. And yes. I definitely use that in just kind of learning little bits about Norton. I don't know what that looks like. Is that just strictly tied to copyright law, or do you think that will move as we progress in years? Or
in theory, and copyright law changes, originally it was supposed to expire earlier, and then I believe it was Disney that sued to hold on to their copyrights longer, which impacted everything. But at this point, I believe every year that passes should step up the years of what's available.
Okay.
That's my understanding, but that could change. Yeah. Copyright law is really complicated. I ran into it with writing my book, and I remember being told by a lawyer, just write it, and if you do something wrong, someone will sue you, which is really not a good way to apply the law. But that's what I was actually told, because it's just that complicated.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's really hard when you're, trying to put together historical, information that's factual. You want to be as close to the information you have or what you found.
Right.
So interesting.
But you are paying for fair use if you subscribe, so that you can do your research. Papers that no longer exist, if they didn't renew a copyright after a certain point, then you're fine. The trickiest part would be newspapers that still are in publication, and some of them are pretty militant about chasing down any violators. But newspapers.com, you are getting access to like share a clipping if you want to.
Yeah.
So if you're paying for the subscription, I wouldn't worry about it. It would be more of an issue if you wanted to publish it in a book.
Right. Gotcha. Let me check the live feed here and make sure that I'm not missing any questions. It doesn't look, I don't have any new questions. I was curious as to what your thoughts are as we move forward and add in our own history. I mean, I know some of that will be in the deed books as we buy houses and move out of them, but what do you see being needed with this whole digital, like it could disappear, or, you know, what, and also just kind of the newspapers themselves also kind of at this crossroads of, you know, you hear a lot of newspapers just shutting their doors or, you know, so I'm just curious what you think should happen.
Those of us whose job it is to capture history are really nervous. In some ways, digital technology lets us capture and share more, which is wonderful. I love being able to post to Facebook pictures that we have in our collection so that other people can enjoy them and see the stories behind them. What scares me though is when the content is only digital, because we're still kind of working out what those formats will be long term. You have something that's called bit rot that can happen with digital images and text. I have a couple of CDs that were photos that the CDs have rotted and are corrupted and are no longer, so I've lost all those photos. So yeah, so there are those things. I think if you wanted to make a gift for the next owner of your property, I would take photos when you remodel or if you do things, or, you know, and then print them out and put them in a proper archival scrapbook for the next owner. And then just let them cherish that. Don't use the magnetic pages because those things are full of acid and will eat anything you put in them. The only way you can get stuff out of those down the line is with a hair dryer. So it's, yeah, don't use those. But even though you've got the risk of losing things in a fire or other ways, if you have, I do both, do a digital backup of any of your information. So much of our lives are shared on social media and we don't even think about them once a few days have passed. And a lot of those pictures are part of our story, which that person won't have access to the way we have access to stories in newspapers from the 1910s or the 1890s. So my worry with newspapers especially is that we just won't have a way. They're not being archived necessarily digitally anywhere, or they don't have a paper format. Sometimes what's really important about a newspaper is the context of what else is happening. You've got something about your house, but then you see that there was a massive storm that day, or that there's an economic crisis. And sometimes the bigger comprehensive story is seeing everything on the front page, not just the thing you need. And so often our stories online are very isolated. They're just their own story. You don't have all of the context of how an economic crisis might affect the banker owner of your house. So those are the things I worry about long term in preserving history. You can take steps to just make sure that you document anything you do to your house for the next owner. And then also make a copy of if you put together your book on the history of your house, make a copy and offer it to your historical society. Because then when someone else buys your house and they go to the historical society can say, actually, we've already got this document to help you get started. And that is a boon, because here, for example, we have a program called Heritage Homes where people research their houses, and we have these binders of the research that they did. So there's a place for people to start if they happen to buy one of these homes down the line. So those are some things that you can do. But the bigger question of what happens to digital media is a really tough one that we're all grappling with right now.
Yeah, definitely. And that's, it is kind of a scary thing. I take a lot of photos of our community and, but I don't have any hard copies of them. They're
Yeah.
all online. So,
And the other issue is you take a lot. It's
yeah,
not like, you know, back in the early 1930s, your family might have 4 or 5 photos taken over 30 years. And now I take 25 photos of my guinea pig who's being adorable in an evening.
yeah,
And I think about that because you've got thousands of photos on your phone, thousands of photos on your computer or tablet, or maybe uploaded to your cloud, and you never look at them again or weed through them or go through and label what's in them. So down the line, what will happen to those is a really interesting question.
yeah. I do have a question here from someone. They asked, can you research information on churches the same way you can research homes and buildings?
Very good question. Absolutely. Churches are still on land, and the land is still going to be documented at the Register of Deeds. So that process is exactly the same. They're not going to be on the tax rolls, but they will be, there's still going to be ownership of the property. Now, some churches, like really little ones, might potentially be renting a church. Or renting a store. Like sometimes you'll see churches that rent a storefront or use a gymnasium or something like that. But if you know where they're meeting, you've got that building to document. A lot of churches have architects as opposed to just vernacular construction. So you're more likely to find architectural information, and you'll know if a church changes denomination. Sometimes one church folds and someone else buys the church. So you would do the same thing. You have a lot more people to research because you might have congregations, you'll have ministers, you might have the choir, you might have church functions that will show up in the newspaper. The chicken soup fundraiser that happens in the fall, or if they're doing a charitable drive. So all of those things will still show up in the paper. What won't, you'll be able to potentially find a rector or a priest if they lived on site. Though probably they didn't live in the church, so they probably would be, if you'd have an additional building, usually a parsonage or something like that. You might have a cemetery attached to your church that will also have a story to research. You'll know who was buried there. So you'll know if repairs were made, you'll know when the steeple was struck by lightning. Those kinds of things show up in newspapers. Fires show up in newspapers. So there's still a whole lot of information on researching the church. And it actually may end up being richer and easier just because churches were and still are prominent community buildings. So you're not just dependent on the people inside the house doing something interesting. So yes, absolutely. Churches are absolutely researchable.
I think that's an interesting point about the tax part of it. I hadn't even considered it. That totally makes sense. Let's see. I'm gonna look through the comments here. There's a comment from, the Norton County Genealogical Society says that they buy microfilm of the Norton Telegram. So that's the current newspaper of our community. So they wanted to make sure that that was available, that as viewers are watching this, they know that the Genealogy Society has that available. So, and they are located in the library, but that I think that's in your resource list that we have already shared.
I try to put local resources, and thank you for helping me put that together. And thank you, Norton Genealogical Society, for investing. I've worked in a library and it's been, 10 years now, but I remember those reels ran like $100 and something a reel. So everyone should be very grateful that you've made that investment.
Yes, definitely. Those newspapers are so, I think we still have some of those old newspapers, but you can't do anything with them. They're just so
they're very
brittle.
Fragile. Yeah. Interestingly, papers from like up to and during the Civil War are in better shape than papers from like the 1920s, because they were still using a newspaper that had like some linen in it. And
Oh,
so some of those papers are still really fresh and wonderful. We have some Western home journals from 1860, 1861 that are as beautiful now as if they'd just been printed. But then you have
wow.
papers from World War II that you open them up and they split across all the seams and they crumple apart because they are very acidic and just tree pulp. So those papers are not nearly, and the paper itself is the problem.
Yes, yeah. And that was something that had been mentioned to me, as if you, it's just way better to print off or use newspapers.com to get your newspaper articles rather than trying to keep your newspaper clippings, because they just disintegrate over time. And I've
Yeah.
even seen that from 1960s newspaper clippings. You can hardly open the paper if it's already been folded. So
Yeah.
that's really interesting.
Yep. The one difference I would say is photographs look better on the original paper than they do on the uploaded microfilm copies. So if you really needed a photograph, if you can go to an original paper, you'll do better if you can't find the actual print.
Okay, that's a good tip. And let me see here if there's any other questions. Looking through comments. I think that covers those that are watching. If you have any other questions, feel free to add them in the comment section, and I can get back to Diana. And if there's something else that comes up, this will be available online, this video, after we're finished. So
and you're welcome to message me through my website as well. Let me know what you find. I love hearing people's house stories. So if you find something really cool, or if you get stuck, send me a message. And if I can help you, I will. And I just want to hear your story. I want to be sharing that joy with you of digging in your house or your business.
Absolutely. We actually have a really beautiful house here in Norton. It's on Park Street, and it's been rehabbed. But the story behind this is just, it's so fanatical, and it just, over the years, this family just becomes more crazy. Like they were just Wild West sort of folks that it's the bouquet house is what they call it. And there was a very rich woman. She came here from Belgium. She didn't come here first. Her son came to Norton, and he started a family. Didn't really have much money, but he settled and with his wife, and he kept asking his wealthy mother for money, like $10,000 at a time. And he said he was starting a business. And anyhow, as the story progresses, she decides she's going to load up and come out to Norton. And she discovers that he's not building a business at all. He's living in a sod house. Oh. And so she ends up investing in the community. She builds this big house. She actually helped keep our auditorium, one of those old, beautiful auditoriums. She helped keep that alive and restored. It's not, now it doesn't exist the way it did, but back then it was just immaculate that we had such a beautiful building. But his story, the son, is really interesting. He ended up marrying like a fake, she said she was a movie star, and he ended up discovering that she was lying. And he divorced his first wife and met this other gal, married her, and she wasn't who she said she was. And then she decided she wanted his money after the divorce. And so there's a lot of newspaper articles covering the case in court. So that house just has a whole lot of history just with that family. So
wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's on my list of things to go look for when I make it to Norton.
Yes, absolutely. I went and checked out their graves a couple weeks ago. I was, needed to take a walk. So I went and I was just curious if they were buried in Norton, and they are, and they have really nice headstones and as wealthy people would. So it was very interesting to see that.
That's fascinating. Oh,
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, and you know, not every house is going to be quite that complicated or
Right.
over the top, but you know, everyone still does things. Their lives are still out there, and they're parts of organizations, and they do all kinds of stuff. So you'll still get to know who was in your house.
Yes, absolutely. And I want to mention this, and we may see if we can have you out again. I think you have provided such wonderful information, and I am just curious. I would love to go hang out with you and check out Norton. So,
That would be
um,
very fun.
so we may have to make that happen. But if you're watching this and you would like to have Diane join you in your community, she is a speaker on the Humanities Kansas Speakers Bureau, and nonprofits can bring in any of these speakers for free, up to 2 speakers in a calendar year. And so it's actually a grant program for the nonprofits. So she is on there. There's a whole list of wonderful speakers, but I think this is a great, you're providing a great resource, especially for these communities getting ready for the Crossroads exhibit, because we have our own little histories that we're trying to highlight as a part of this exhibit. So I'm hoping that you've just really helped some people kind of get started on their research here. So.
Well, I'm excited to see what you guys do, and I really do hope to get out your way. And if you're out my way, if I'm not in my house, I'm living at the old Depot Museum, which is a restored 1888 depot that serves as our county museum. So you can find me there. But yes, I'd love to hear how people are doing, and hopefully one day I will be out your way. This pandemic, I mean, we are living history right now.
Yes.
So, you know, document what's happening to you. And I'm sure historical societies in your area are, like I have staff who are recording, doing screenshots of Facebook posts and businesses closing, and we're taking pictures in town of signs on doors. Because in 100 years, we're going to be looking at what happened now, the same way we're looking at the 1918 flu pandemic. So, you know, record what's happening because it matters.
That's an excellent tip. I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I think about it in the context of my little world, that as an organization, that's a really, that's needed for our communities.
Yeah. We're thinking like right now, like what do we need to worry about right now? But in a historic context, especially since everything is online, it's going to disappear. And it's playing out in real time in social media in a way it wouldn't have in the newspapers 100 years ago. So, you know, take pictures of your kids doing their online learning. You know, take pictures when you take a walk. Document the fact that you had a hardship because you didn't have a job for 3 months, because those stories are going to matter.
Yes. Oh, this has been so great. And I was going to mention those, the directory way back in your presentation, you had mentioned the business directories. And I think that's, I mean, I don't know if we're still doing those. So I would be, I mean, right now would be especially relevant.
Yeah, and Polk directories were kind of the standard for a long time. And I think they're entirely online. You can still buy one, but they're like $100 and something, $150, $175 a piece. Wow. So usually the library or somebody will buy one. So hopefully that thing gets protected and carefully copied. Because, you know, if it's online, it gets updated and you don't keep the historic data.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Well, I think that's about all. There's some other information that we've, I hope that we haven't missed. I think I've got all your links on there. Oh,
okay.
I'm dinging here. Hold on just a minute.
Okay.
Question. Oh, no, they're just commenting, wanting to watch the video. So This will
Cool.
be available online after we are finished. It will be available for anyone to watch. And this isn't just for Norton County. I mean, a lot of the information you provided was relevant for any county, really, other than the local, super local stuff.
Right.
But most counties will have some version of those local resources.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so easy to share this. I mean, every local community will have some things that are indicative to their community. You're going to have that book about that one thing in your community that someone wrote. But a lot of the basic tools are applicable no matter where you live in the state.
Yes. Excellent. Well, I think that covers just about everything. I did post a link to your website so people can jump on there and message you with questions.
Absolutely.
Or they can contact us on this. And I think that covers pretty much everything. Thank you again so much for your time. I'm glad we finally got this going.
Me too. Thank you for experimenting with me on how to do this online.
Yeah, I think we learned some things. So hopefully we can do this again with other speakers. So thank you so much, Diana.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye.